Most people think they need motivation to start, but the brain doesn't rewire because you're inspired. It rewires because you repeat. If you're waiting for a burst of energy to show up before you take action, you're outsourcing your life to chance. Consistency is not a reward, it's a requirement. The first few times you do something you don't want to do, whether it's waking up earlier, exercising, studying, or building anything worthwhile, your brain resists. It's not trying to sabotage you. It's just wired for efficiency, and anything new feels like a threat to the system. That resistance you feel, that's not weakness. That's neurochemical friction. It's your brain trying to protect its current wiring. But here's the truth. Friction is the price of transformation. When you force yourself to act anyway, you engage a very specific system in the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is responsible for override. It tells the limbic system, the part screaming, "I don't want to sit down and stay quiet." That override process is what builds neural strength. It's not the act itself. It's the override. And here's what's fascinating. After several repetitions, the resistance fades. Why? Because the circuits adapt. They say, this is now who we are. Your identity starts to shift, not because you said affirmations, but because you earned a new self through repetition. The identity of a consistent person is forged by doing the work when it feels hardest. Many people misunderstand dopamine. They believe they need it to begin. But dopamine is not fuel for starting. It's the neurochemical of progress. You don't get it at the beginning. You get it from effort. When you push through resistance and complete the task, even if it's done imperfectly, the dopamine spikes afterward. Do that again and again, and your baseline levels rise. This is how you become someone who wants to show up. In the early stages of change, cortisol is high. This is the stress hormone, and it surges when you disrupt old patterns. But this isn't a signal to stop. It's a signal to lean in. Because on the other side of elevated cortisol is neural remodeling. You're carving new grooves into the brain, and that takes biological effort. If it feels hard, good, that means it's working. You can accelerate this process by anchoring the behavior to time. When you do something at the same time daily, you link it to your circadian rhythm, your brain's internal clock. That turns the behavior from a conscious choice into an unconscious one. And over time, it stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like part of who you are. Eventually, consistency becomes automation. It moves from the prefrontal cortex, where it takes willpower, into the basal ganglia, where habits live. This is what freedom looks like, when effort becomes identity and identity leads to ease. But that only happens if you force yourself to start and force yourself again and again, not perfectly, just daily. Let me know if you'd like this adapted into a video script, podcast style, or broken into short reels. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure and function based on experience. It's the foundation of learning, habit formation, and personal transformation. However, a major misconception people have is that neuroplasticity is triggered by inspiration or motivation. That if you feel mentally ready, the brain will magically reshape itself. In reality, neuroplasticity does not follow motivation. It follows repetition. Change happens when circuits are repeatedly activated over time, regardless of how you feel during those repetitions. The human brain is an energy-conserving organ. It prefers to rely on existing pathways that have already been reinforced through past behavior. When you start something new, whether it's a physical routine, a cognitive skill, or an emotional habit, your brain doesn't automatically make room for it. Instead, it resists. That resistance is the nervous system's way of protecting its current architecture. But when you return to the task again and again, even when it feels difficult or boring, you're sending a signal to the brain. This behavior matters. The only language the brain truly understands in terms of rewiring is repetition. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This classic principle of neuroplasticity means that the more frequently, two neural circuits are activated in sequence, the more likely they are to form a long-lasting connection. For example, if you repeatedly practice focusing for a certain amount of time, the networks involved in attention, executive control, and reward anticipation become stronger and more synchronized. If you repeatedly avoid tasks, procrastinate, or wait for motivation to strike, you reinforce the networks of avoidance and impulsivity. In both cases, the change in neural wiring is not dictated by what you intended, but by what you repeated. Motivation is often fleeting. It's linked to external stimuli, what you see, what you hear, and how you feel in the moment. But repetition doesn't depend on mood. In fact, repetition in the absence of motivation is what creates long-term change. When you perform a behavior, even when it's uncomfortable, or when you feel no emotional reward, you are leveraging what's called top-down control. That means you're activating the prefrontal cortex to override emotional brain areas like the limbic system. That override function is a neuroplasticity accelerator. Every time you do this, you reinforce the circuit of discipline and self-directed action. Moreover, repetition modifies the strength of synaptic connections. Each time you repeat a behavior, the brain increases the efficiency and speed of the neural signals involved in that behavior. At first, a new habit or skill requires conscious effort. It demands attention, creates mental fatigue, and often triggers resistance. But as the repetitions continue, the required effort declines. This is because the neural pathways become more insulated with myelin and more efficient at firing. What once felt hard starts to feel automatic. Not because it got easier, but because the brain got better at doing it. Timing and consistency in repetition also matter. Sporadic efforts don't lead to structural changes in the brain. Neuroplasticity responds to consistent input. Daily practice, even in small doses, is more effective than intense but irregular effort. This is why habits form more effectively when they are part of a predictable routine. The brain begins to anticipate the action, and anticipation itself starts to trigger associated neural circuits, further deepening the habit loop. Over time, the behavior becomes so ingrained that it no longer feels like a choice. It becomes part of your identity. Another critical factor in repetition-based plasticity is feedback. When the brain receives a signal that a behavior had a positive outcome, dopamine is released, which reinforces that neural connection. But even without a significant reward, repetition still works. The brain adapts through sheer frequency of action. That's why forcing yourself to do something repeatedly without waiting for motivation creates structural change. The more you fire a circuit, the more permanent it becomes. Eventually, the brain stops asking whether you feel like doing it. It just does it because that's the new normal. This is the essence of training the nervous system for long-term consistency and identity transformation through repetition rather than emotional readiness. Discipline is often glorified as a smooth, streamlined force of willpower, but its true origin is much messier. Discipline begins with internal friction. It starts in the gap between what you know you should do and what you feel like doing. That friction is not a flaw. It's a necessary biological and psychological signal. It's the sound of old neural circuits being challenged and new ones struggling to form. It is uncomfortable by design because your nervous system is built to protect efficiency and familiarity, not growth. The moment you decide to do something difficult, something outside of your current pattern, you ignite this resistance. That's where real discipline is born. When you try to change a habit, build a new routine, or adopt a healthier behavior, your brain encounters a threat. Not a literal threat, but a perceived disruption to its predictable pathways. The brain is a prediction machine. It thrives on routines and expects outcomes based on past behaviors. When you decide to wake up earlier, start exercising, or focus instead of scrolling, your nervous system responds by generating discomfort, restlessness, self-doubt, and mental fatigue. This is not weakness. It's a product of how your brain handles uncertainty and change. That initial tension between intention and impulse is where the process of discipline begins. Neurologically, this friction is the clash between your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, decision-making, and regulation, and the limbic system, which is wired for pleasure, safety, and ease. The limbic system wants immediate gratification. It doesn't care about long-term goals or identity evolution. It just wants to feel good now. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, can forecast the future. It holds your values, your vision, and your goals. When you choose discipline, you are choosing to activate your prefrontal cortex over the emotional and reward-seeking circuits of the brain. That activation is not seamless. It's an energetic process that takes conscious effort, and it feels like resistance. But with repetition, this activation becomes more efficient and the friction lessens. Friction is also biochemical. When you push against your usual behaviors, stress hormones like cortisol can rise. You may feel agitation, anxiety, or fatigue. This isn't a signal to stop. It's the body's way of adapting to a new demand. Cortisol, in this context, is not purely negative. It mobilizes energy and attention. But if you interpret the internal resistance as a sign of failure, you will retreat back into old patterns. On the other hand, if you understand that discipline always starts with tension, you can use that feeling as feedback. You can recognize that the presence of discomfort means you are in the exact zone where change is possible. In many ways, discipline is the act of choosing long-term alignment over short-term relief. And that choice doesn't come from ease, it comes from repeated friction. Over time, the more you engage in that decision-making loop, the more those neural circuits become automatic. You begin to delay gratification more easily. You start to anticipate the payoff of consistency instead of the comfort of quitting. But all of that depends on how you respond to the initial pushback inside your own nervous system. People often wait to feel ready or energized before they act. But discipline is what develops in the absence of readiness. When your body says no, when your emotions resist, and when your thoughts provide every justification to avoid action, that is when discipline is forged. You are not waiting for alignment. You are creating it by acting against the grain until the grain starts to change direction. Over time, the very behaviors that once caused friction become sources of familiarity and ease. This is the result of neural adaptation. The circuits that were once hard to activate become dominant. But the cost of that transformation is paid upfront through deliberate discomfort. You have to push against the internal resistance again and again. Not perfectly, not enthusiastically. That's the hidden structure of discipline. It doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with struggle, discomfort, and mental noise. And the choice to move forward anyway is what strengthens the architecture of discipline within the brain and body. Cortisol, often labeled as the stress hormone, plays a central role in how the body and brain respond to challenges. When people feel internal resistance, whether it's emotional discomfort, hesitation, anxiety, or even fatigue, they often interpret those signals as warnings to stop. But biologically, cortisol and resistance are not stop signs. They are signals of neural activation and adaptation. They mark the beginning of transformation, not the failure of it. Misinterpreting these sensations as threats rather than cues delays progress and reinforces avoidance pathways in the brain. True behavioral change depends on recognizing stress and resistance as part of the process of rewiring. Cortisol is released by the adrenal glands in response to stress, and its role is to help mobilize energy and sharpen focus. It's a survival mechanism, not a punishment. In the context of personal growth, learning, or habit building, cortisol rises when you're pushing outside your comfort zone. It increases your vigilance and prepares your system to adapt. In other words, the presence of cortisol doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It often means you're doing something unfamiliar and significant enough for the brain to pay attention, That attention is required for plasticity, and plasticity is required for lasting change. The problem arises when people assume that feeling resistance or tension is a signal to turn back. Resistance, mental, emotional, or physical, is the natural result of encountering boundaries between your current identity and the version you're trying to become. When you try to stay focused on a task and find yourself distracted, or when you set a goal but procrastinate acting on it, that resistance isn't laziness or lack of motivation. It's a neurobiological signal that you're trying to override a deeply embedded pattern. The body responds with stress, not to stop you, but to alert you that something new is happening and energy needs to be redirected. When cortisol rises during difficult tasks, it can make the experience feel heavier. You might experience racing thoughts, rapid heart rate, or a spike in self-doubt. But instead of interpreting these sensations as evidence that you're on the wrong path, it's more accurate to see them as byproducts of neural and hormonal recalibration. Your body is trying to keep you alive and stable, not optimized. So when you start disrupting old patterns, whether it's through disciplined work, fasting, cold exposure, intense learning, or even social withdrawal for reflection, the system flags it. That flag is not saying stop, it's saying adapt. This distinction is critical for consistency. Most people believe they should feel clear, focused, and ready before committing to change. But readiness is often the result of adaptation, not the prerequisite for it. Cortisol and resistance are signals that your nervous system is now engaged. You're no longer in autopilot mode. You've stepped into conscious effort, which is the only mode that creates neuroplasticity in adulthood. Unlike children, adults require focused attention and emotional intensity for the brain to change. Stress is often necessary for the nervous system to tag a moment as important enough to store and reinforce. Furthermore, how you interpret resistance directly shapes the neural circuits that form. If you feel discomfort and retreat, the avoidance behavior gets strengthened. If you feel discomfort and lean in, you signal to the brain that effort in the face of stress is valuable. This encourages the brain to rewire toward resilience. Over time, as you consistently engage with these uncomfortable states rather than escape them, your brain becomes more efficient at tolerating cortisol, and your threshold for stress increases. This is known as stress inoculation, and it builds psychological durability. Resistance can also be a form of emotional inertia. When you're trying to transition into a focused state, your mind may wander or resist structure. That psychological drag is the echo of previous habits. It's the nervous system conserving energy by preferring default settings. But just like warming up before physical exercise, mental friction at the beginning of a task is expected. The initial rise in cortisol is not a wall, it's a hill. And once you crest it, neurochemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine begin to rise, supporting deeper engagement and focus. But to get there, you must push through the initial resistance instead of interpreting it as a stop sign. Understanding this reframes stress entirely. The goal is not to eliminate cortisol or avoid discomfort. The goal is to relate to them differently, to see stress as a guidepost for where growth is occurring, to recognize that the presence of resistance means your brain is being challenged, which is the condition required for adaptation. Once you stop avoiding those signals and start using them as cues to lean forward, you begin to shift the biology of discipline, motivation, and identity from something you hope for into something you train daily through consistent engagement with discomfort. Time-stamping behavior, intentionally performing specific actions at consistent times, has a powerful effect on shaping identity. It does more than organize your day. It encodes behavior into the architecture of your nervous system. When you repeat a behavior at the same time every day, the brain begins to associate that time window with that specific activity. This repeated synchronization forms strong neural links between the circadian system and the behavioral circuits being activated. Over time, these behaviors transition from deliberate choices into elements of identity. You're not just doing something anymore, you're becoming someone who does it. The human brain thrives on rhythm and predictability. The circadian clock, which regulates sleep, energy, hormone levels, and cognition, also governs when the body is primed for different types of activity. This internal clock is not static. It adapts to the patterns you give it. When you perform a behavior like journaling, working out, meditating, or studying at the same time every day, your brain begins to anticipate that behavior before it even happens. This anticipation leads to the release of neurotransmitters that support readiness, focus, and performance. The body begins preparing for the behavior hours in advance, and what was once difficult starts to feel natural. That is not coincidence, that is entrainment. Neuroscientifically, time-stamping behaviors allows the prefrontal cortex to collaborate with the hypothalamus, which manages circadian rhythms. This coupling of executive function with biological rhythm reinforces habit loops. For example, if you consistently work on a goal every morning at 7 a.m., the brain starts recognizing that hour as an activation cue. Over weeks and months, that window of time becomes a trigger for the neural network associated with effort, attention, and reward pursuit. The more precise you are with timing, the faster this network strengthens. Eventually, when that hour arrives, you begin acting without internal debate. That's the transition from habit to identity. Consistency in timing also reduces cognitive fatigue. Decision-making consumes energy, especially when motivation fluctuates. When a behavior is not anchored to a specific time, you spend mental bandwidth negotiating with yourself about when or whether you'll do it. But when the time is fixed, the decision is already made. The brain no longer sees it as optional, but as a part of the day's structure. This reduces the psychological load and strengthens the behavioral circuit by allowing more energy to be spent on execution rather than initiation. Over time, this energy efficiency reinforces the sense of, this is just who I am. There's also a hormonal alignment that occurs when behaviors are time-stamped. Hormones like cortisol and testosterone follow a diurnal rhythm. Cortisol typically spikes in the early morning, providing energy and alertness. If you engage in demanding tasks during this natural peak, the experience feels more aligned with your biology. Over time, your body begins to prepare for that task even more efficiently. As the neural and hormonal systems sync, performance improves, resistance decreases, and the behavior becomes part of your embodied identity. In behavioral psychology, identity is not built through abstract affirmation. It is constructed through repeated action. But more specifically, repeated action under specific conditions. Time is one of those key conditions. A behavior done randomly feels like effort. A behavior done daily at the same time begins to feel like personality. You no longer think of yourself as someone who tries to be consistent, you become consistent. The brain and body interpret the rhythm of your actions as data for identity. If you always train at the same hour, read at the same hour, or work on your creative craft at the same hour, those actions begin to encode the narrative of who you are. Even subtle behaviors, when time-stamped, can accumulate into identity-level change. A person who walks every day at the same time starts to internalize the identity of being someone active and intent. A person who reflects or writes each morning begins to see themselves as self-awareness and disciplined. The behavior may seem small, but the timing gives it gravity. It carves a groove in the neural schedule, and that groove deepens with each repetition. The identity that emerges is not the result of how hard the behavior was, but how precisely and consistently it was placed within the structure of time. Consistency is often misunderstood as a personality trait, something you either have or don't have. In reality, consistency is a neural mechanism that reinforces specific behaviors through repetition until they no longer require conscious effort. When a behavior is repeated regularly, especially under similar conditions, it creates a blueprint within the brain. Over time, this blueprint becomes so strong that the behavior shifts from being effortful to automatic. This transition is what's known as long-term autopilot, not a passive state, but a highly efficient neural mode where the brain conserves energy by relying on established patterns. The nervous system is designed to prioritize efficiency. Every decision, every behavior, and every shift in attention demands energy. When a new habit or goal is introduced, the brain treats it as unfamiliar and metabolically expensive. It requires attention, planning, and emotional regulation. But with consistent repetition, the brain begins to streamline the process. It wires together the neurons involved in that behavior more tightly, reducing the amount of energy required to execute it. The more consistent you are, the stronger and faster this neural adaptation becomes. Eventually, the behavior embeds itself in a part of the brain that operates largely beneath conscious awareness, allowing it to run on